Just thinking about sleeping with that fat pig makes my stomach turn. Those words hit me like a sniper's bullet to the chest. I'm Wesley Hartwell, 58 years old, and I've spent 35 years building Oak Ridge Vineyard from nothing into a $12 million operation. But nothing in my 20 years as a Marine or decades of hard work prepared me for what I heard that Sunday morning, just minutes before my daughter's wedding. I was standing outside the preparation room at St. Michael's Cathedral in Sonoma County, adjusting my dress uniform tie out of old Marine habits, when I caught my future son-in-law confessing his true feelings to a friend through the slightly open door. "At least you get the vineyard and all of Wesley's money," came a friend's voice, followed by the clink of glasses, a toast to my daughter's humiliation. Another voice chimed in mockingly, "You'll need a whole bottle of whiskey to perform tonight, Preston." My hands started trembling. I stepped closer to the crack in the door and heard Preston Blackstone again, cold and calculating. "Of course I'm putting up with it for the money. Without Oak Ridge Vineyard, I wouldn't even look at her." The laughter that followed cut through me like shrapnel. Someone even whistled mockingly. I felt like my heart was being ripped from my chest. Every word was a direct assault on my dignity as a father and a man who'd spent 35 years building something meaningful. Time stood still. My blood boiled and my legs went rigid like I was back in combat in Iraq during my 3 tours of duty. But this wasn't enemy fire. This was something far worse. This was the betrayal of my daughter's trust, my family's honor, and everything I'd worked to build. I took a step back, dizzy, and bumped into Mrs. Rodriguez, one of our vineyard neighbors. She looked at me with concern, noticing my pale face. "Are you all right, Wesley? You look like you've seen a ghost." With more effort than it took to carry wounded Marines in Fallujah, I managed to respond, "Just a little heat, ma'am. Nothing serious." But it wasn't nothing. In that moment, I knew my daughter Madison was about to marry a man who despised her, saw her as nothing more than a pathway to our family's wealth. And I, her father and protector, had to make the hardest decision of my life. The California sun was warming the stone steps of the cathedral that morning. Guests had been arriving slowly, greeting each other with handshakes and congratulations. The courtyard filled with the sound of a string quartet and the scent of fresh coffee from the church ladies' reception table. "Wesley, your daughter's marrying a real winner," Pete Morrison, an old friend from the wine industry, had told me earlier, that Preston knows his business. I'd nodded politely, but something about Preston had never sat right with me. Maybe it was my Marine training, but I could smell trouble from miles away. Now I knew my instincts had been correct. I forced myself to walk with quick steps toward Madison's preparation room, those cursed words drilling into my brain. I couldn't let anyone else see what I'd discovered, at least not yet. I needed to think like the Marine I once was, assess the situation, plan the mission, execute with precision. When I entered Madison's room, the scene looked like something from a wedding magazine. My daughter sat in front of a mirror in her white dress, the veil falling over her shoulders like a waterfall. She smiled nervously while the makeup artist added final touches, and Brooke Sullivan, her best friend, adjusted the veil carefully. Seeing her like that, so excited and innocent, squeezed my heart even tighter. The image of the little girl I'd taught to ride horses around our vineyard now turned into a woman about to make the biggest mistake of her life, contrasted brutally with the venomous words I'd just overheard. Other bridesmaids moved around carrying fresh flowers and calming tea to settle the bride's nerves. Everything looked perfect, like any wine country wedding should. But I knew the truth now. My daughter was walking into a carefully laid trap. I knocked softly and entered. Everyone turned around, surprised by my serious expression. "I need to speak with my daughter alone," I said with the authority that 20 years in the Marines had taught me. They hesitated for a moment, then agreed. One by one, they left the room, leaving only Madison, Brooke, and me. I closed the door slowly, pulled up a chair, and sat facing my daughter. I watched her hands play nervously with her bouquet, not knowing that my world had shattered just minutes before. In that moment, I knew my daughter's happiness was about to be crushed by the most bitter betrayal. The question was, should I tell her the truth and destroy her wedding day, or stay silent and watch her marry a man who saw her as nothing more than a fat pig and a meal ticket? The decision would change everything. I placed my hands over Madison's, still trembling from what I'd heard, My daughter looked at me through the mirror, her eyes bright with excitement but also nervous energy. The fresh makeup made her look like a princess, but I could barely hold her gaze, knowing what I was about to say. "Sweetheart," I said with a voice rougher than gravel, "I need you to listen to me carefully." Outside in Preston's room, I just heard something that broke my soul. Madison raised her eyebrows, that nervous smile still on her lips. "What happened, Dad?" she asked, tilting her head like she used to as a child when she was confused. I swallowed hard. There was no easy way to deliver this intelligence. In the Marines, we called it a situation report. Direct, factual, no sugarcoating. But this was my daughter's heart I was about to shatter. Preston was laughing with his friends. I heard it clearly. He said he was only marrying you for the money, for the vineyard. And he called you... I paused, the words sticking in my throat like broken glass. He called you a fat pig. The silence became thick as morning fog over our vineyard. Madison looked at me in disbelief, opened her mouth, and let out a forced laugh that sounded hollow in the small room. "Dad, that can't be true," she whispered, gripping the bouquet tighter. Her knuckles went white. "Preston always tells me I'm beautiful. Always." I saw her lips tremble and her eyes begin to water. The carefully applied makeup started to smudge as tears formed. "No, sweetheart," I responded with the firmness I'd used commanding troops. "I didn't hear wrong. He said it multiple times. His friends were making fun of you, and he confirmed every word." Madison shook her head violently, like she could shake away the truth. Tears started running down her cheeks, ruining the makeup gradually. That's when Brooke Sullivan, who'd been standing behind her adjusting the veil, immediately stepped forward. "Wesley, with all due respect, maybe someone's spreading lies," Brooke said, her voice carrying a certainty that seemed too forced to be innocent. "I've seen how much Preston cares for Madison. He's always attentive, always loving." Her hands gripped Madison's shoulders like she was trying to anchor her to that chair, to that decision. Something about Brooke's reaction triggered my tactical instincts, the way she positioned herself between Madison and me, the quickness of her defense. "Brooke, I'm not talking about rumors," I insisted, raising my voice with the authority that had made soldiers listen during firefights. I heard it with my own ears through his door. Madison sobbed, covering her face with both hands. The bouquet fell onto her lap, white roses scattering across her wedding dress. "No," she moaned. "I don't want to hear it. It can't be true." Brooke immediately moved closer, caressing Madison's back with what looked like a protective gesture. "Madison, don't let this ruin your day. Nerves make people imagine things. Your dad's just worried about losing you, but we can't let paranoia take over." I clenched my fists, fighting against a helplessness I hadn't felt since watching wounded Marines die in my arms. This was different, but no less devastating. "Madison," I continued, softening my voice like I'd done when she was scared as a child, "I'd give my life for you. I wouldn't lie about something like this. I'd rather you hate me for telling the truth than watch you suffer from a deception." She lowered her hands and looked directly at me. Her red, swollen eyes were full of confusion and pain. "Dad, do you really think Preston doesn't love me? That it's all about money?" I nodded with the weight of absolute certainty, the same certainty I'd felt when calling in artillery coordinates. "Yes, sweetheart. That's exactly what I heard, and it hurts me more than anyone to have to tell you this on your wedding day." Brooke stepped forward, almost positioning herself as a human shield between Madison and me. "Wesley, I'm sorry, but I think you're letting your protective instincts cloud your judgment. Preston's a successful businessman. It's natural he talks about finances with his friends, but that doesn't mean he doesn't love Madison." I noticed how Brooke sought Madison's eyes, as if trying to plant doubt about my credibility. In Iraq, we'd learned to recognize when someone was running interference, providing cover for the real enemy. My tactical radar was screaming warnings. In that moment, someone knocked urgently on the door. One of the bridesmaids peeked in, her face flushed with excitement and hurry. "Quick, it's time! The priest is waiting for everyone! The ceremony needs to start now!" The cathedral bells began ringing loudly outside, their bronze voices marking that the ceremony had to begin. Madison wiped her tears with the back of her hand, her whole body trembling like she was in shock. The moment of truth had arrived. Brooke quickly took a handkerchief from her purse and began fixing Madison's smudged makeup with practiced movements. "Come on, friend," she whispered urgently. "Don't ruin this day. Don't think about negative things." Madison took a shaky breath, picked up her scattered bouquet, and nodded like a soldier accepting orders. I stood there speechless, watching as my daughter rose, and instead of hugging me or trusting my words, clung to Brooke's arm like a lifeline. "Dad, please don't say anything else." "Not now," Madison said, her voice barely above a whisper. Those words went through me like a bayonet. I wanted to grab her, shake sense into her, make her see the trap she was walking into. But the urgency of the moment and her obvious choice gave me no room to maneuver. Madison left first, her wedding dress rustling against the doorframe. Brooke followed, throwing me a look I'll never forget. A mixture of challenge and triumph, like she'd won some kind of victory. Something about that look told me this woman knew more than she was letting on. I walked behind with heavy steps, my mind racing through tactical options. The hallway was crowded with excited guests. Music signaled the ceremony's start, voices mixing in a growing murmur of anticipation. We reached the cathedral's main entrance. Madison appeared on the threshold, radiant despite her forced smile. Through the open doors, I could see Preston waiting at the altar, impeccable in his expensive suit, wearing an expression of insulting confidence. People began applauding and murmuring admiringly. "What a beautiful bride," someone said near me. "Wesley must be so proud." I took my assigned seat in the front row, still hearing the echo of those damned words echoing in my head. I watched Madison walk toward the altar, taking Preston's arm, clinging to the man who had just humiliated her without her knowing it. The cathedral organ began its solemn music. Everyone stood up. I remained seated for a moment, breathing deeply, trying not to collapse in front of 200 guests. My Marine training kicked in. When you can't change the mission, you adapt and prepare for the next phase. Finally, I stood slowly, my eyes fixed on my daughter, knowing she was walking into the enemy's trap, and I, her father, hadn't been able to stop her. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The cathedral bells rang out with force, filling every corner of the ancient temple. Guest conversations died down as everyone found their places on polished wooden pews that gleamed under light filtering through stained glass windows. Sunbeams painted the floor with red, green, and blue patterns that seemed to dance mockingly. I took my place next to my cousin Larry and his wife, who'd driven up from Los Angeles. Larry leaned toward me and whispered excitedly, "Wesley, Madison looks like royalty." I nodded slowly, forcing myself to contain the rage boiling inside me. How could I explain what I'd heard without destroying this moment that everyone else was celebrating? The irony burned. They were all witnessing what they thought was a beautiful union, while I knew it was actually my daughter's execution. The great wooden doors opened slowly, and there appeared Madison on Preston's arm. The string quartet outside fell silent, replaced by the organ's solemn notes traveling through the central nave like a funeral dirge. Guests stood up, turned their heads, and let out exclamations of admiration. "How beautiful," someone murmured. "She looks like a princess," said another voice. I looked at her with a soul split in half. Her smile was luminous, her eyes shining like those of the little girl who once hid behind my legs at the vineyard when she was shy. But behind that smile was blind innocence, misplaced trust that I'd failed to protect. Preston walked beside her with confident steps, chest out like a conquering general. From time to time he adjusted his tie and threw knowing glances at friends sitting near the aisle. He even sketched a twisted smile that only I seemed to notice, the smile of a predator who'd successfully cornered his prey. The priest began the ceremony, his deep voice resonating off the high vaulted ceiling. The choir responded with soft hymns that mixed with murmured prayers from the congregation. Everything appeared perfect except for the unbearable weight crushing my chest. My hands gripped the edge of the pew so hard my knuckles turned white. In front of me, Madison advanced step by step toward a destiny I knew was poisoned with lies and greed. When the moment for vows arrived, I heard how her voice trembled with genuine emotion, repeating the sacred words the priest guided her through. Preston, on the other hand, recited his lines with exaggerated confidence, like an actor playing a well-rehearsed role for an audience of fools. I watched him with silent hatred while he looked at my daughter with eyes I now knew were calculating every dollar of her inheritance. When they exchanged rings, the youth choir sang a sweet song that brought tears to several guests. I only felt a stab in my stomach, like taking shrapnel all over again. Brooke, always positioning herself strategically, adjusted Madison's veil at that crucial moment and threw me a quick, enigmatic look that confirmed my suspicions about her involvement. The "I do" resonated loudly off the cathedral walls. People burst into applause. The bells rang out again, and the priest raised his arms to bless what I knew was a cursed union. I lowered my head, closing my eyes for a moment, trying not to show the bitterness consuming me like acid. Outside, the courtyard filled with rice and rose petals raining on the newlyweds. The band played with festive energy while children ran behind the couple throwing streamers. Women shouted, "Long live the bride and groom!" The air smelled of gunpowder from fireworks thundering in the distance. Madison, radiant in her ignorance, waved her hand, thanking every congratulation. Preston raised a champagne glass someone had offered him, toasting everyone as if he'd just conquered territory instead of married a woman. A caravan of decorated cars waited at the entrance. The newlyweds got into a vehicle adorned with white flowers and cans dragging from the bumper. I rode with my cousin Larry in his SUV, surrounded by relatives chattering excitedly about the beautiful ceremony. "That Preston has a good head for business, doesn't he, Wesley?" Larry said, adjusting his rearview mirror. "With him, Oak Ridge Vineyard's going to prosper like never before." His wife nodded enthusiastically. "Such a perfect match. Madison's so lucky." I remained silent, staring out the window at rolling hills covered with grapevines that stretched until they vanished from sight. None of them could imagine that what I'd heard that morning had turned their innocent praise into knives twisting in my chest. We arrived at Oak Ridge as the California sun began to set, painting the stone walls of our main building golden. The entrance was decorated with arches of purple flowers and yellow lights hanging from the ancient oak trees that gave our vineyard its name. The atmosphere should have been perfect, almost like a county fair celebrating our family's success. In the main garden, round tables covered with white tablecloths extended across our best vineyard view. Every table displayed platters of grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, and steaming casseroles that gave off irresistible aromas. Waiters moved between guests, serving glasses of our premium Cabernet Sauvignon and specialty cocktails. The band kept playing, encouraging younger guests to clap along. A group of ladies danced to the beat, their colorful dresses swirling in the evening breeze. Everything looked like a portrait of happiness and success, but I knew it was all built on lies. Preston moved between tables like a politician working a crowd, greeting, embracing, laughing loudly with that fake charm I'd learned to recognize. An air of triumph surrounded him, as if the wedding wasn't a commitment of love, but a business contract he'd just signed for maximum profit. Everyone looked at him with admiration, calling him son, and congratulating him on joining our family. What they didn't know was that he saw them as nothing more than useful idiots celebrating his successful con job. Madison sat at the main table, surrounded by friends and relatives who talked to her constantly. She smiled and responded appropriately, but my trained eye caught how several times she lowered her gaze, exhausted by maintaining her happy bride performance. No one else seemed to notice the cracks in her facade. I stood in a corner with a glass of our reserve Chardonnay, watching in tactical silence. My eyes stayed fixed on my daughter, fearing she might break under the pressure of pretending everything was perfect. I decided to approach her, to check how she was really holding up after our conversation. But just as I took a step forward, Brooke appeared again, always lurking like a sentry. She leaned toward Madison, whispered something urgent in her ear, and immediately guided her away by the arm. "Let her enjoy herself, Wesley," Brooke told me with that artificial smile that never reached her eyes. "It's her special day." I stopped dead in my tracks, recognizing the maneuver. Brooke was running interference, keeping Madison isolated from anyone who might plant doubts about her new husband. This wasn't random friendship. This was coordinated strategy. The rage rose to my throat like bile, but I forced myself to hold back. I lowered my gaze, stepped away, and remained motionless, watching how my daughter was being led around like a puppet with Brooke pulling the strings. The celebration continued around me, clinking glasses, laughter, endless toasts to the happy couple. For everyone else, it was an unforgettable party. For me, it was the beginning of a war I was determined to win. But I also knew something they didn't. My Marine training had taught me patience, planning, and precision execution. Preston Blackstone had no idea what kind of enemy he'd just made. Several weeks passed after the wedding, and all the celebration noise disappeared suddenly. Where before there had been music, toasts, and congratulations, only an uncomfortable silence remained that hung in the Sonoma Valley air like morning fog over our vineyard. At Oak Ridge, the harvest workers continued their routines. The crew kept tending the vines, but I noticed conversations stopped when I approached. Something had changed in the atmosphere, and not for the better. That Thursday morning, I decided to drive into downtown Sonoma for my weekly supply run. It was a routine I'd maintained for years, checking with distributors, buying materials, staying connected with the local wine community. I climbed into my Ford F-150 and drove toward town. Traffic was busy with tourists visiting wine country. People hurried with shopping bags and cameras. Everything seemed normal until I parked and started walking through the farmer's market. From my first step, I felt the stares. They weren't the usual respectful nods from fellow business owners. These were long, judgmental stares, accompanied by whispers that made no effort to hide their content. I walked through the main aisle between produce stands. The smell of fresh herbs and grilled corn mixed with smoke from food trucks. But what weighed most was the murmuring that followed me like a shadow. A woman selling organic vegetables spoke loud enough for me to hear. They say Wesley made up stories about his son-in-law because he's jealous about losing control of his daughter. Her neighboring vendor let out a dry laugh. That old man's too controlling. Obviously scares away any decent man who shows interest in Madison. I kept walking without stopping, but the words pierced me like needles. At the spice stand where Maria, an elderly lady who'd known me for years, barely acknowledged my presence. Normally, she'd offer samples of her herbs or ask about our latest vintage. This time she lowered her gaze and simply weighed my order in silence. When I extended money, her fingers barely brushed mine, as if she was afraid contamination might spread through touch. Putting bags in my truck, I heard laughter from young men near the butcher shop. One shouted sarcastically in a mocking voice, "Fat pig! Fat pig!" Explosive laughter followed. They were using the same words I'd heard from Preston's mouth, now turned into public mockery spreading through our community like poison. I felt shame burning my face, but my Marine training held firm. Never show weakness to the enemy. On the drive home, I passed kids playing soccer who started chanting and running alongside my truck. "Fat pig! Fat pig!" They didn't understand what they were saying, just children repeating what they'd heard adults discussing at dinner tables. Every syllable weighed on me like lead. I stopped for a moment, watching them scatter, and realized how thoroughly Preston's poison had spread through our tight-knit community. Back at Oak Ridge, landscape looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted. Workers were busy with vine maintenance, but I noticed younger crew members looked away when I approached. That's when Carlos, my foreman for over 20 years, approached with his hat in weathered hands. "Senor Wesley, don't pay attention to town gossip," he whispered paternally. "People talk too much without knowing truth." His warning confirmed my fears. The community had started believing Preston's version of events. Somehow, my attempt to warn Madison had been twisted into a story of a jealous, controlling father making up lies about an innocent son-in-law. That evening, I sat on our main house porch looking toward the valley. California sky was clear and distant. Sonoma lights twinkled like fireflies. Dogs barked at neighboring ranches while cricket songs filled darkness. I'd survived 3 tours in Iraq, built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing, even lost my wife to cancer. But I'd never felt isolation this cruel, knowing that my own community, people who'd watched me work this land for decades, now viewed me as a bitter, ridiculous old man was almost unbearable. I lit a cigar and watched smoke rise in spirals. Every puff was a useless attempt to expel shame pressing against my chest. Night wind carried jasmine scent and road dust, but not even familiar aromas could calm my anger. I stayed there until late, listening to distant city sounds and my own churning thoughts. What had started as an insult in a despicable man's mouth had become an echo spreading through our entire community. I, Wesley Hartwell, who'd dedicated 35 years to building this vineyard and protecting my family, was becoming the target of widespread mockery. But that night's silence made something crystal clear. This was no longer just about protecting Madison. Now I had to recover my honor before they buried it completely under laughter and lies. And I knew exactly how to start fighting back. It was a hot Tuesday afternoon when I decided to visit Madison in her new house in Sonoma's historic district, where she'd moved with Preston after their honeymoon. The neighborhood was quiet and elegant. Houses with old facades, wrought iron balconies, and cream-colored walls that seemed to watch me with the indifference of old money. Trees were blooming, purple petals falling on sidewalks like confetti from a celebration I wasn't invited to. In that peaceful setting, some children played basketball in driveways, their laughter echoing off vintage architecture. I stopped in front of Madison's door, took a deep breath, and knocked softly. Several seconds passed before the door opened. There was my daughter, with tired eyes, dark circles, and that forced smile that hurt me more than any public insult. "Dad, what a surprise," she said, trying to inject enthusiasm into her voice. I hugged her briefly and entered. The smell inside was a mixture of strong tobacco, expensive whiskey, and new leather furniture. The living room was in disorder. Not the comfortable mess of newlyweds, but the chaos of someone working frantically on something important. On the coffee table were several glasses with wine residue, overflowing ashtrays, and papers scattered everywhere like evidence of hasty business dealings. In the corner, I saw Preston behind an improvised desk made from our old dining room table, one Madison had taken from our family home. In front of him was a pile of folders and official-looking documents. A half-consumed Cuban cigar rested in a crystal ashtray, filling the room with expensive smoke. With his other hand, he held an elegant fountain pen that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Beside him, Madison was methodically signing document after document without pausing to read the contents. I approached slowly, feeling a familiar punch to the gut, the same sensation I'd felt when walking into ambushes in Iraq. "What are you signing, sweetheart?" I asked, placing a protective hand on the back of her chair. Madison looked up briefly, smiling. With obvious fatigue, "Dad, they're just routine procedures for Preston's investment company, nothing complicated." Before I could respond, Preston raised his head with that smile that had frozen my blood since day one. "Exactly, Wesley," he said with smooth confidence. "Just administrative documents, boring legal stuff, really." I didn't move, but my eyes scanned the scattered papers with tactical precision. Among the bold legal text, I could distinguish the phrase, "power of attorney," appearing multiple times. I also clearly read Oak Ridge Vineyard and property transfer rights. My hands went cold as winter fog. Preston stood up casually, walked to an expensive sideboard, and poured 3 glasses of top-shelf whiskey. He extended one to me with a gesture that seemed generous, but felt like mockery. "Are you staying for dinner, Wesley? A drink before the meal would do you good." I shook my head, forcing myself to maintain calm while my Marine training screamed warnings. "No thanks, I was just checking on you both. I need to get back to the vineyard before dark." Madison got up and went to the kitchen. The sound of plates and glassware echoed from the next room. I seized those precious seconds like a soldier taking advantage of enemy distraction. I leaned over the table and, pretending to adjust my reading glasses, quickly pulled my phone from my pocket. With hands that had once handled explosives under fire, I took rapid photographs of every visible document. My heart hammered like machine gun fire inside my chest as I read fragments: vineyard mortgage, loan guarantee, transfer of property rights, liquidation authorization. It was enough to confirm my worst fears. This wasn't about love or marriage. This was a systematic financial assault on everything I'd built. Madison's footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing closer. I slipped the phone away instantly, closed the folders, and sank into a leather armchair, grabbing a wine magazine from the side table as camouflage. Preston, watching me from his position, took a slow puff from his cigar and exhaled smoke with the calm confidence of someone who believed his secret was safe. Madison entered carrying a tray with gourmet sandwiches and a pitcher of iced tea. She set it down with a weak smile that broke my heart. "Dad, try some. I made them fresh." I took one bite, but the expensive cheese tasted like cardboard. My appetite had vanished completely. "Thanks, sweetheart, but I really must go. I have urgent matters at the vineyard." I stood up quickly, hugging her tight when saying goodbye, breathing in the scent of her hair as if trying to memorize it. She returned the embrace without suspecting that I'd just discovered the full scope of her husband's betrayal. Preston approached the door to escort me out with that half-smile that never left his face. "Drive safely, Wesley. These country roads can be dangerous in the dark." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. I looked Preston straight in the eyes, searching for some trace of humanity behind his polished facade. I found only calculation and cold arrogance, the same look I'd seen in enemy combatants who believed they held all the advantages. I left without another word. The evening air hit me like a physical blow, but it didn't cool the rage building in my chest like molten steel. I walked to my truck, hearing children still playing basketball, completely oblivious to the financial warfare being waged in their neighborhood. Halfway home, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled into a roadside cafe with metal tables and plastic chairs. the kind of place where working people grabbed quick meals between shifts. I ordered black coffee and with trembling hands pulled out my phone. I reviewed the photographs one by one, each image confirming the scope of Preston's systematic theft. Everything was there: absolute power of attorney over Oak Ridge Vineyard, land mortgage authorizations, bank loan guarantees using our property as collateral. My daughter had been signing away her inheritance one document at a time, trusting the man who called her a fat pig behind closed doors. I sat staring at the screen for a long time, coffee growing cold between my fingers while people entered and left around me. The world continued its normal course, but I was paralyzed by the magnitude of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just personal betrayal. It was financial warfare designed to strip away everything our family had built over 35 years. Preston wasn't just using Madison emotionally, he was systematically looting our life's work with her unwitting signature. I finished the bitter coffee, got back in my truck, and drove to Oak Ridge with one clear objective. I was going to war, and I was going to win. The next morning found me sleepless, sitting at my kitchen table with printed photos spread like intelligence reports across the oak surface. My heart pounded with the rhythm of an approaching battle. I knew I had to move fast and smart. Preston was already months ahead in his operation. I prepared a briefcase with the evidence and drove toward Sonoma, where Garrett Reynolds waited. Garrett had been our family lawyer for decades, a former JAG officer who'd transitioned to civilian practice after 15 years in military legal services. His office was housed in a historic building with dark wooden walls and the familiar smell of old law books mixed with fresh coffee. Shelves lined with worn case files and faded legal precedents told stories of years defending honest people against sophisticated criminals. Garrett received me standing, his silver hair perfectly groomed and reading glasses perched on his nose, the bearing of a man who'd prosecuted military courts-martial before taking on civilian cases. "Wesley, you sounded urgent on the phone. What's the situation?" I handed him the printed photographs without preamble. He studied them methodically, his expression growing darker with each page. As a former military lawyer, he recognized the legal implications immediately. "This is extremely serious, Wesley," he said finally, setting the papers down with the weight of a court ruling. "With these signatures, your son-in-law has legal authority to sell the entire vineyard operation. Worse, he can mortgage it, leverage it for loans, even liquidate assets until there's nothing left." I remained motionless, feeling like I'd been hit by an IED blast. The silence stretched between us while the full implications sank in. "What are my options, Garrett?" I asked, my voice carrying the strain of a man watching his life's work disappear. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled in thought. "We need more evidence than these documents alone. Any judge would rule that Madison signed voluntarily. We need proof of fraud, deception, or coercion. For that, we'll need professional investigation." He reached for his phone. "I know exactly the right person for this mission. Mason Crawford, former police detective, military veteran like yourself, served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining law enforcement. He's thorough, discreet, and gets results." The next day, I met Mason at a downtown cafe, one of those brick-walled establishments with wooden tables scarred by years of serious conversations. The aroma of cinnamon and fresh bread filled the space, but I was too focused to notice. I was nervous, playing with my coffee spoon when Mason appeared. He was about 50 years old, with sun-weathered skin, gray mustache, and eyes sharp as a sniper's scope. He dressed simply in a worn leather jacket and carried a small notebook, the tools of someone who'd learned to blend into any environment. He sat across from me and went straight to the point with military efficiency. Garrett briefed me on the basics. "What exactly do you want me to investigate, Wesley?" I told him everything: the overheard conversation at the wedding, the community rumors turning against me, the documents Madison had unknowingly signed. I showed him the photographs on my phone, watching his expression remain professionally neutral. He studied the images without reaction, took a measured sip of black coffee, and nodded with the certainty of someone who'd seen similar cons before. "I'll put him under surveillance," Mason said matter-of-factly. "This Preston doesn't seem legitimate to me. Most inheritance scams follow predictable patterns. There's usually more than just document fraud involved." He pulled out a standard contract and slid it across the table. "I'll need a $5,000 retainer and 2 weeks to develop a complete profile. If he's running a con operation, I'll find the evidence you need." We shook hands with the firm grip of veterans who understood mission commitment. Mason left as quietly as he'd arrived, leaving behind only the faint scent of tobacco and leather. The following days stretched endlessly. At Oak Ridge, I tried maintaining normal operations, checking vine health, meeting with distributors, managing our 25-person crew. But during every quiet moment, I checked my phone, waiting for intelligence from Mason. Finally, one evening, my phone rang with the call I'd been waiting for. I found him. Mason's voice was calm but satisfied. "Meet me at the Sonoma Inn tonight, room 247. I have evidence that will change everything." My heart accelerated like an engine under full throttle. I drove through Sonoma's darkening streets toward the historic inn where Mason waited with whatever evidence he'd uncovered. The old building rose before me with its Victorian facade and narrow stairs that creaked under decades of footsteps. I climbed to the second floor and found room 247. Mason opened the door immediately. He'd been watching through the peephole. The small room was transformed into a surveillance command center with closed curtains, a laptop computer, and thick manila envelopes spread across a small table. "Sit down, Wesley," Mason said, his expression serious as battlefield intelligence. "What I'm about to show you is going to change everything you thought you knew about this situation." He handed me the first envelope with steady hands. I opened it with fingers that had once diffused roadside bombs but now trembled with anticipation. Inside were crystal-clear surveillance photographs that hit me like physical blows. Preston holding hands with an elegant woman outside an upscale San Francisco restaurant. Another photo showed him embracing her around the waist, both laughing together like lovers who'd been together for years, not like a man married for barely 6 weeks. "Her name is Sierra Mitchell," Mason explained, pulling out a detailed background report. "She's a senior executive at California Central Bank, specializes in agricultural property financing. But she's much more than just Preston's mistress. She's his business partner in this entire operation." I studied each photograph with the methodical attention I'd once used examining enemy positions. The woman was sophisticated, expensive-looking, clearly someone with access to serious financial resources and insider banking knowledge. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, my voice hoarse with controlled rage. "Based on my surveillance and background checks, at least 18 months. Long before he even met Madison. This relationship predates his entire courtship of your daughter." Mason turned his laptop toward me, adjusting the screen so I could see clearly. "But the photographs are just the beginning. Listen to this." He pressed play on an audio file. Preston's unmistakable voice filled the small hotel room, clear and damning. "That Madison is easier to manipulate than we expected. With her signatures, the entire vineyard operation will be ours by Christmas." Then came Sierra's sharp, cultured laugh, the sound of someone who viewed other people's suffering as entertainment. "Putting up with that little pig is definitely worth it for $12 million in premium California vineyard property." The sound of champagne glasses clinking followed, then more laughter as they celebrated their successful con game at my daughter's expense. I froze completely. Air stuck in my lungs like I was drowning. My hands began sweating while waves of rage and heartbreak crashed over me simultaneously. Madison, my innocent daughter who still went to sleep believing she'd found true love, was being systematically destroyed by people who saw her as nothing more than a stepping stone to wealth. Mason turned off the recording and poured black coffee from a thermos into 2 styrofoam cups. The silence stretched between us while I processed the full scope of what I'd just heard. "There's more," Mason continued, opening another folder. "Preston's real name is actually Preston Blake. He's used the Blackstone alias for the past 3 years while running inheritance scams up and down the West Coast. He showed me police reports, victim statements, and financial records documenting a pattern of targeting wealthy families with unmarried daughters. He's successfully stolen approximately $8 million from 4 different families over the past 5 years. Your daughter isn't his first victim. She's just his biggest target." The revelation hit me like artillery fire. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or even simple greed. It was systematic predation by professional criminals who specialized in destroying families like mine. "How does he choose his targets?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Mason pulled out another report. "Sierra uses her banking connections to identify high-value agricultural properties with single female heirs. They research family dynamics, financial structures, even personality profiles before Preston makes his approach. It's sophisticated and thoroughly planned." He showed me surveillance photos of Preston studying our family from a distance. Pictures taken at wine industry events, community gatherings, even outside Madison's college before she graduated. He'd been watching your daughter for over a year before arranging their accidental meeting at that wine tasting event. The methodical nature of their operation made everything worse. Madison hadn't just fallen for the wrong man. She'd been hunted, stalked, and targeted by professionals who made their living destroying innocent people. "What about his previous victims?" I asked. "Are any of them willing to testify?" Mason's expression darkened. "Two families were completely destroyed financially and refused to get involved. But there's one exception, his own brother, Dalton Pierce, Preston's most recent victim before targeting your family. He opened a final folder containing family photographs and legal documents. Dalton's father invested his entire retirement savings in one of Preston's fake business ventures. When the old man discovered the fraud, he suffered a fatal heart attack. Dalton's mother has been bedridden with grief ever since. The story made my blood run cold. Preston wasn't just stealing money, he was literally killing people and destroying entire families in his wake. Dalton lives about 2 hours north of here," Mason continued. "He's been trying to build a case against his brother for months, but lacks the resources and connections. With your evidence and his testimony, we might finally have enough to stop Preston permanently." I stood up, pacing the small hotel room like a caged animal. Everything was falling into place. Preston's confident arrogance, Sierra's banking expertise, even Brooke's suspicious behavior at the wedding. This was a coordinated assault by career criminals. "Arrange a meeting with Dalton," I said with military decisiveness. "It's time to turn the hunter into the hunted." 2 days later, I drove north through California's wine country toward the small town where Dalton Pierce lived. The road stretched through rolling hills covered with vineyards that reminded me of everything Preston was trying to steal. Mason had arranged the meeting at a roadside bar called Murphy's Tavern, the kind of place where working people drank beer and spoke truth without pretense. The building looked forgotten by prosperity, with weathered walls, a flickering neon sign, and a wooden door that groaned when pushed. Inside, darkness was thick with cigarette smoke and the echo of country music playing from an ancient jukebox. I found him in the back corner, exactly as Mason had described. Dalton Pierce sat hunched over a small table with a bottle of beer and the defeated posture of a man who'd lost everything that mattered. His wrinkled shirt and bloodshot eyes told the story of sleepless nights and endless guilt. I approached slowly, pulled out a chair, and sat across from him with the directness Marines learn in combat zones. "I'm Wesley Hartwell from Oak Ridge Vineyard. Your brother destroyed my family, too." Dalton raised his head, focusing cloudy eyes on me with a mixture of recognition and contempt. "Did you come to defend that bastard? Get lost. I have nothing to discuss with his victims." I slowly placed the envelope of evidence on the scarred wooden table between us. "I didn't come to defend him. I came to destroy him." He hesitated before opening the envelope, hands trembling as he went through photograph after photograph. Preston smiling with Sierra Mitchell like they owned the world. Bank documents showing systematic fraud, audio transcripts of their conversations planning the next family to target. Dalton's jaw began tensing with each piece of evidence. "Damn him to hell," he spat with years of accumulated rage. "This is exactly how he operates. Exactly the same pattern." I pulled out my phone and played Mason's recorded conversation. Preston's voice filled the stained walls of the bar. "That Madison is easier to manipulate than we expected. With her signatures, the entire vineyard operation will be ours by Christmas." Dense silence fell over our table like a funeral shroud. Dalton squeezed his beer bottle until his knuckles turned white, then suddenly smashed it against the table, sending foam and glass shards flying. Several patrons turned to stare, but the bartender kept cleaning glasses as if violence was routine entertainment. Dalton looked at me with eyes full of unshed tears and began speaking, almost spitting every word with venomous precision. "That miserable bastard didn't just steal from us, he murdered my father as surely as if he'd put a gun to his head." He pulled out his wallet and showed me a faded photograph of an elderly man in work clothes, smiling beside a small farm truck. My dad worked 40 years building a small cattle operation. Preston convinced him to invest everything in some fake agricultural technology company. Dad signed over the ranch, his retirement savings, even borrowed against my mother's life insurance. Dalton's voice broke with emotion. When Dad discovered the business never existed, that Preston had stolen everything, he collapsed from a massive heart attack right there in our kitchen. Mom found him on the floor, clutching Preston's fake business cards. I listened in horrified silence as Dalton continued. Mom hasn't spoken a complete sentence since the funeral. She just sits in her wheelchair, staring at nothing. The doctors say it's severe depression, but I know it's really a broken heart. Preston didn't just steal our money. He murdered my parents' spirits. The story confirmed my worst fears about Preston's methods. He wasn't just committing financial fraud. He was systematically destroying families and leaving psychological devastation in his wake. "Dalton, I need your testimony," I said with the urgency of a military mission briefing. "My lawyer says we have enough evidence to prosecute, but we need someone willing to testify about Preston's previous crimes." He stared into the bottom of his broken beer bottle for long minutes while bar noise continued around us. A pool game clacked in the background. Someone fed quarters into the jukebox. Life went on while we planned justice for families torn apart by greed. Finally, he looked up with tear-filled eyes that had found new purpose. "I'll testify. That bastard deserves to rot in prison for what he's done." I raised my unfinished beer and clinked it against his broken bottle. The sound echoed louder than normal, like a pact being sealed between warriors. We're going to stop him from destroying any more families. Over the next hour, Dalton provided detailed testimony about Preston's methods, how he'd studied their family finances for months before approaching their father, how he'd used fake business references and forged documents to create credibility, how he'd convinced a trusting old man to sign papers that destroyed 40 years of honest work. He even attended Dad's funeral, Dalton said bitterly, stood there with fake tears, comforting Mom while knowing he'd killed her husband. We agreed to meet at Garrett's office the following week to prepare formal legal statements. Dalton would drive down from his current job as a ranch hand, work he'd taken, to pay for his mother's medical care after Preston's fraud destroyed their family finances. When I left Murphy's Tavern that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced since discovering Preston's betrayal. Hope. For the first time, I wasn't fighting alone. Now we were two wounded men united by the same enemy, and we had the evidence needed to destroy him. As I drove back toward Oak Ridge under star-filled California sky, I knew the war against Preston Blackstone was entering its final phase. Justice was coming, and it would be swift, thorough, and absolutely devastating. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Several months of legal preparation led to this moment. Final sentencing day at the Sonoma County Courthouse. That morning, I woke before dawn and dressed in my best suit, the same one I'd worn to military ceremonies when justice mattered more than politics. The courthouse plaza was packed with media, curious townspeople, and vineyard workers who'd come to support our family. Cameras flashed as I climbed the stone steps with Madison beside me, her hand firmly gripping my arm for the first time since her wedding day. Inside the courtroom, tension was thick as fog. Every seat was filled. I recognized several victims from Preston's previous scams, people who'd driven hundreds of miles to witness justice being served. Dalton Pierce sat in the front row, wearing his best shirt and holding a photograph of his deceased father. The bailiff called for order as Judge Morrison entered. Everyone rose in unison, the sound of shuffling feet and rustling clothes filling the solemn space. Garrett Reynolds stood to present our final evidence, months of investigation condensed into an irrefutable case. The audio recordings played through courtroom speakers, Preston's voice admitting to systematic fraud and calling Madison that little pig while planning to steal our $12 million vineyard. Sierra Mitchell's laughter echoed off the walls as she celebrated destroying innocent families for profit. Several people in the gallery gasped audibly. I saw Madison flinch at hearing herself described so cruelly by the man she'd trusted with her heart. When Dalton took the witness stand, his testimony was devastating. He spoke clearly about watching his father die from the shock of discovering Preston's betrayal, about his mother's complete mental breakdown, about families destroyed by calculated greed. "My father trusted Preston because he seemed like family," Dalton said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "But Preston saw us as nothing more than targets to be robbed and discarded." Preston sat at the defendant's table in an expensive suit, probably purchased with stolen money. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by the pale complexion of a man watching his empire collapse. Sierra Mitchell was notably absent. She'd fled to Switzerland when arrest warrants were issued. His defense attorney tried claiming the recordings were fabricated, that Preston's marriage to Madison was genuine love, corrupted by business pressures, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, surveillance footage, and testimony from multiple victims painted a clear picture of professional criminal operation. Judge Morrison listened impassively as prosecutors detailed Preston's crimes: grand theft, fraud, elder abuse in Dalton's father's case, and conspiracy charges related to Sierra's banking insider knowledge. Finally, the moment arrived. Judge Morrison adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Preston with the cold gaze of military justice. Preston Blake, also known as Preston Blackstone, you have systematically destroyed families for personal profit. Your crimes represent the worst kind of betrayal, using marriage and trust as weapons to steal people's life work. The courtroom was dead silent except for the scratch of court reporters' pens. For aggravated fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse resulting in death, I sentence you to 12 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 8 years. Additionally, you will pay full restitution to all victims, including $2.5 million in punitive damages to the Hartwell family. The gavel's bang echoed like gunfire. The courtroom erupted in applause from victims and supporters. Dalton Pierce stood and shouted, "Justice for Dad!" Several vineyard workers cheered from the back rows. Preston's composure finally cracked completely. He turned in his chair, scanning the courtroom with wild eyes until he found me. His look was pure hatred, as if his downfall was my fault, rather than the consequence of his own evil choices. "This is all lies," he screamed as bailiffs approached with handcuffs. "You people destroyed an innocent man." But his protests were lost in the noise of justice being served. Guards led him away in shackles while reporters shouted questions and cameras captured his final moments of freedom. Outside the courthouse, Madison and I stood together in California sunshine as media surrounded us. For the first time in months, my daughter looked at peace. The lines of stress had faded from her face, replaced by the determined expression I remembered from her childhood. "Dad," she said quietly, squeezing my arm, "I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I'm sorry I let him trick me into signing those papers." I hugged her tight, feeling years of pain begin to heal. "You don't need to apologize, sweetheart. You trusted someone who was supposed to love you. That makes you human, not stupid." We drove back to Oak Ridge Vineyard as the sun set over our hills. The vines were heavy with grapes ready for harvest, a metaphor for justice finally ripening after months of patient cultivation. That evening, we sat on the main house porch where I'd spent so many lonely nights planning this campaign. Madison reviewed contracts with our wine distributors, taking active control of business operations for the first time. "I want to learn everything about running this place," she said, underlining important clauses with a pencil. "No one will ever manipulate me again." I lit a cigar and watched smoke rise toward stars appearing in the darkening sky. The sound of workers finishing their shifts drifted across our property. Honest people doing honest work, the foundation of everything worthwhile. The sweetest revenge, I told my daughter, wasn't seeing him in prison. It was seeing you free and strong, ready to protect what we've built. We sat in comfortable silence as night settled over Oak Ridge Vineyard. The nightmare was over. Justice had been served, and my family was whole again. I've learned that blind trust can destroy us, but a father's love never surrenders. Truth always finds its way, however long the journey. May God bless anyone fighting to protect what they love. Semper Fi.